Montana Territory, October 1877. The wind carried a sharp edge as it swept through the pines, scattering gold leaves across the worn trail. It was barely past dawn when Xander Zebley spotted the glint of something unnatural through the trees, something pale and still beneath a tangle of fallen limbs. He pulled his dappled gelding to a stop, narrowed his eyes, and slid off the saddle. "Hello," he called out, voice firm but cautious. A faint cry answered him, weak and strained. He pushed through the underbrush, boots cracking twigs, until he saw her. A young woman lay tangled beneath a splintered pine branch as thick as a fence post. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, one arm pinned, her face streaked with dirt and blood. Her chest rose and fell fast, but she was alive. "Stay still," he said, kneeling beside her. "You're going to be all right." Her lips were cracked, her voice hoarse. "It came down storm last night. I could not move." He drew his hunting knife from his belt, testing the weight of the branch with one hand. "What's your name?" "Rowena," she whispered. "Rowena Gilley." "Xander Zebley," he said, gripping the blade. "I'm going to cut it away. It might hurt some, but I'll get you out." She nodded, teeth clenched. He started working, sawing through the branch at an angle. The wood was green and stubborn, and the scent of sap filled the air. She winced when the branch shifted, groaning against her shoulder. "It will not be much longer," he said, glancing at her. "You alone out here?" "My horse spooked. I was riding to my uncle's ranch, 2 miles north, got caught in the storm." The branch snapped loose with a final crack. He tossed it aside and gently helped her sit up. "I think my ankle's twisted," she said, grimacing. "I will take you to your uncle's," he said. "Can you hold on to me?" She nodded, and he lifted her into his arms. She was light, but he could feel the tremble in her muscles, shock, pain, exhaustion. "I owe you my life," she murmured against his chest. "Let us just get you home first," he said, voice low. He rode slow, keeping her steady before him in the saddle. Her breath warmed the collar of his coat. Her head rested against his shoulder, and he could feel her trying to stay awake. They reached the ranch just as the sun broke over the ridgeline. Her uncle, a gray-haired man with a shotgun, rushed out when he saw them. "Rowena," he cried. "What in heaven?" She was trapped under a branch. "I found her near the creek trail," Xander said as he dismounted, carrying her toward the porch. The man's face went pale. "Storm tore through hard last night. I was about to ride out looking for her. They took her inside." Xander helped settle her on a cot by the hearth while her uncle fetched bandages and boiled water. She winced as her boot came off, revealing a swollen ankle already turning purple. "You saved her life, Mr. Zebley. Xander Zebley." "Well, Mr. Zebley, you are welcome here any time." Rowena reached for Xander's hand as he turned to leave. "Please do not go just yet." He looked down at her fingers curled around his. Her eyes were wide but steady. "I will stay," he said. Later, when her uncle left the room, Xander sat near the fire, watching the light flicker across her face. "You could have ridden on," she said softly. "You did not have to stop. I could not have left you there." She studied him, lips parted slightly as if she wanted to say more. Outside, the wind had settled. The storm had passed. He looked at her long, taking in the shape of her, the strength in her despite what she had just endured. "You are kind," she said. He shook his head. "No, just a man who saw someone who needed help." Her hand found his again. "Still, I am glad it was you." He did not answer, just held her hand, letting the warmth settle between them. And for the first time in a long while, Xander Zebley felt something steady in his chest, like maybe the trail was finally leading somewhere worth going. By the second day, the bruising around Rowena's ankle had darkened, and her uncle had fashioned a sturdy splint using willow strips and strips from an old saddle pad. She hadn't stood yet, but the pain had dulled into something manageable. Xander had stayed, taking to the barn and chores without being asked, as though he'd always belonged to the quiet land around them. That morning, he returned from hauling water to the trough, his coat damp from the dew that clung to the grass. Rowena sat on the porch bench, wrapped in one of her uncle's wool blankets, her leg propped on a crate. She watched him approach with a cup of chicory in her hands, the steam curling up into the cold. "You work like you were born to it," she said as he climbed the steps. He removed his hat and set it on the rail. "I worked cattle in the Judith Basin for 5 years, got used to early hours and stubborn animals. You're a long way from that basin." He nodded, sitting beside her but careful not to crowd. "The outfit I rode for sold out. New owner brought in his own men. I drifted north, took to trapping and hauling freight when I could." She sipped, then asked, "And before Montana?" He looked out toward the barn, jaw shifting slightly. "Arkansas. My folks had a patch of land near the Wachita, lost my father in the war. My mother followed not long after." Rowena didn't speak right away. Her hand tightened slightly around the tin cup, then loosened. "My mother died when I was 12, she said finally. "My father tried to raise me, but he wasn't built for stillness. He left the year after. Uncle never married, so I came here." Xander's gaze returned to her, steady and quiet. "You've done well with what you had." "I don't know that I've done much," she said, then added with a faint smile, "but I've learned how to split kindling and shoot a coyote before it gets the chickens. That counts for more than most folks think." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that settled without weight. A pair of magpies flicked from tree to tree near the pasture, their calls echoing sharp and strange. "You miss the basin?" she asked. "I miss the horses. And the way the sky looked when the sun came low over the breaks, but places change, people too." She glanced down at her wrapped leg. "Do you think I'll walk proper again?" "I do." "You that sure?" "No," he said, "but I've seen worse heal." She looked at him, eyes catching a fleck of gold in the light. "You don't talk like most men I've met." "I never saw sense in saying what I didn't mean." She nodded, thoughtful. "That's rare." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "If you'd like, I can stay through the week, help out while your ankle sets right." Rowena didn't answer at once. She traced a thumb along the rim of her cup, then looked up and met his eyes. "You're welcome to." Her voice wasn't soft, but it held something settled like a gate swinging open, slow and deliberate. Later that day, she watched from the window as he worked the fence-a-line with her uncle. He moved with a kind of deliberate calm, nothing hurried, hands sure in everything he touched. She found herself cataloging the way he paused to listen when her uncle pointed something out, or how he wiped his palms on his trousers before lifting the post-hole digger again. That night she asked her uncle, "What do you think of him, Zebley? He's the kind that doesn't say more than he needs to, but he's steady." "That's what I thought," she said, then added, "Would it be all right if he stayed longer than a week?" Her uncle studied her face, then gave a small nod. "You'd best be the one to ask him." She didn't answer, just turned her gaze back to the fire, the light drawing lines across her cheek like sunrise breaking through trees. By the 6th morning, frost clung to the window panes and the sky broke open with the pale blue clarity that only came after a hard night freeze. Xander had risen early again, but this time he didn't head straight for the barn. Instead, he brought in a crate of apples he'd gathered from the trees near the creek, small, tart things, but clean and firm. He set them on the porch beside Rowena and offered her a knife. She glanced at him, then the fruit. "You plan to dry them. I thought you might want to." "For winter stores." She accepted the knife, turning one of the apples in her palm. Most men wouldn't think so far ahead if it wasn't their own larder. He eased down onto the step beside her, rolling up his sleeves. "I've gone hungry enough times to know how far a little forethought can carry you." She began slicing, thin and even. Despite the stiffness in her ankle, her hands were steady. "You ever think of settling again?" she asked after a long silence. "Sometimes," he said. But it never seemed like the right place, or the right reason. She didn't speak again for a while, only passed him slices to lay across the drying frame her uncle had rigged the season before. Her fingers brushed his once, and neither of them acknowledged it aloud. That afternoon, while her uncle rode into town for supplies, Rowena hobbled to the small garden plot with Xander's help. Her weight leaned into his arm, and each step was slow, measured, but she didn't complain. "Never thought I'd need help walking through my own yard," she said. "You're not a woman who asks for help lightly," he replied. She looked up at him, something unreadable in her eyes. "It's easier when help comes without debt attached." They reached the plot. The frost had curled the edges of the cabbage leaves, and the last of the beans hung limp on their vines. Rowena knelt with effort, brushing dirt from a carrot top. "I used to plant with both hands in the soil," she said. "Felt like I belonged to the earth more than to any house or name." Xander crouched beside her. "You still do." She shook her head. "Not like before. Not since I started thinking about leaving." He kept his hand still, letting her speak. "I had it in my mind," she continued, "that I'd make it to Helena, find work stitching or keeping ledgers. I didn't want to be dependent." "You wouldn't be," he said. "Not here." She didn't answer. The quiet stretched, full of something unspoken. That evening after supper, she surprised him by asking if he played. "Cards?" he asked. "No," she said, reaching behind the hearth and pulling out a fiddle wrapped in a wool cloth. "Music?" "I don't," he said honestly. "But I'll listen." She tuned the strings, her fingers moving with memory. Then, without preamble, she played soft, slow notes that rose and fell like breath. The tune was unfamiliar, something shaped by solitude and long winters. When she finished, she set the fiddle down carefully. "My mother taught me," she said. "Before she passed." He nodded, unsure what to say that wouldn't feel like intrusion. She looked at him then, not shy, not uncertain. "Will you stay, Xander?" He met her gaze. "If you want me to." "I do." Her voice held no hesitation, just the truth of it. And in that moment, something shifted, not loud or sudden, but sure. Like the way roots settle deep after the first frost. Like the sound of home being made quietly between two people who'd never asked for it but found it anyway. The first snow came early that year, dry and fine as sifted flour, laying a thin crust over the field behind the barn. Xander stood near the fence post, hammer in hand, watching flakes settle on the leather of his gloves. The sky had gone the color of pewter, dusk pressing in before the day had finished stretching its limbs. Rowena opened the door behind him and stepped outside, wrapped in her uncle's old riding coat. Her ankle was still stiff, but she moved without the crutch now, testing her weight slow and stubborn as new grass pushing through frost. She didn't speak until she reached the fence. "You always work past light?" she asked. He tapped the last nail into place, set down the hammer, and pulled his gloves off. "Only when it's something worth finishing." She leaned on the post beside him, eyes scanning the field that was now more white than brown. "Uncle's been talking about selling off his smaller stock before the cold sets in. Feed's too tight." Xander nodded. "I saw the haystack. He's right." She rubbed her fingers together, warming them. "He asked if I'd stay on through winter. Said he could use the help keeping the books and tending the hens." "You thinking of it?" Her breath left a small cloud in the air. "I was headed for Helena before the storm. Thought I had it all laid out in my mind. But now that I'm whole again, I keep wondering if maybe I was running more than searching." Xander looked over, the wind lifting a strand of her hair across her cheek. "You don't strike me as someone who runs." "I wanted to be needed somewhere," she said. "But I forgot that needing isn't always the same as belonging." He didn't answer right away. A crow called once from the pine ridge, then went quiet. "You belong here," he said, "if that means anything coming from me." She turned toward him, not smiling, not soft, but clear-eyed. "It does." They stood like that, the silence not empty but full of things they hadn't found the words for. After a while she said, "There's a quilt I've been piecing together. My mother started it before she passed. I found it packed away in my uncle's trunk. Thought maybe I'd finish it before the year turns. What's it look like?" "Mostly star blocks, deep blues and tobacco browns. She stitched each one by hand. I reckon I'll do the same." Xander tilted his head. "You want help sorting the fabric? You ever threaded a needle, Zebley?" "Not well. But I can match colors and I've got patience." She considered that, then nodded once. "All right." That evening they sat at the table beneath the oil lamp. Rowena spread out the squares, worn but clean, some already pieced, others waiting. Xander matched them by tone while she stitched, the thread slipping through cloth with a rhythm older than either of them. "What kind of life did you imagine?" she asked, not looking up. He folded two squares together, lining the edges. "Quiet, land under my feet. Someone to ride out with in the morning and come home to at night." She tied off a stitch and reached for another square. "You never said if you had family left." "No blood kin. Just a few men I rode with, scattered now, none close." Rowena pressed a seam flat with her thumb. "Then you're free to go anywhere." "I suppose I am," he said, "but not every place feels worth staying." She didn't answer, but her needle paused mid-stitch. He watched her hands a moment, then said, "I'd like to build a small cabin come spring. Just west of the pasture where the land rises a little." She looked up, her face unreadable. "That near enough, only if you want it to be." The wind outside picked up, brushing against the walls like a passing thought. Inside, the fire held steady, and her answer came not with words, but with the way she reached across the table and laid her hand over his, their palms lined with callus and warmth. By late November, the last of the potatoes had been pulled, and the hens had taken to roosting early, their bodies fluffed against the creeping cold. The snow had deepened, but the paths between the house, barn, and woodshed stayed clear, tamped down by steady boots and the wide tracks of the sled Xander had built from scrap timber. Rowena's ankle had healed enough that she walked without favoring it, though she still moved with a careful slowness that hadn't been there before. That morning, she found Xander in the lean-to, oiling the blades of a crosscut saw. His coat hung from a nail, sleeves rolled, forearms streaked with sawdust and axle grease. She stepped inside, tucking her hands into her shawl. "You've been quiet since the weather turned," she said. He set the saw aside and wiped his hands on a rag. "Been thinking." She waited. "I've got enough saved to buy lumber come spring," he said. "Not milled, but sound enough for framing. I was thinking about how to lay the foundation before the ground thaws." Rowena stepped closer, her breath visible between them. "You told me once you wanted someone to ride out with in the morning. What else do you want?" He looked at her without flinching. "A place that holds. Someone who chooses it with me." She reached out, fingers brushing the space just above his wrist. "I've never chosen any place for longer than a season, but I keep waking to the sound of your boots on the porch, and the sky hasn't felt empty since." He took her hand, turning it over gently. "Then stay, not because it's safe, but because it's yours, same as mine." She nodded once. "I will." They married 3 days later, under the cottonwoods at the edge of the pasture, where the snow had melted into patches of black earth. Her uncle stood beside them, solemn and proud, the same wool coat buttoned tight against the wind. The preacher from the mining camp rode out with a Bible wrapped in oilcloth, and a voice worn from years of dust and smoke. No guests, no ribbons, just the words, the vow, the steady press of Xander's hand in hers. She wore her mother's brooch pinned at her collar. He had trimmed his beard and combed his hair flat. Afterward, they shared a meal of rabbit stew and cornbread, and when evening fell, they sat by the fire in the front room, side by side on the bench he'd built from cedar planks. "I never pictured it like this," she said, eyes watching the flames. "Like what?" "Simple, still, but I wouldn't trade a single moment of it." He turned toward her. "I'd live it twice just to find you in it." She leaned into him, her temple resting against his shoulder. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, soft and low, like a song only the land knew. They spent that first winter in the main house, sharing chores with her uncle, rising with the light and working by kerosene and hearth. Xander carved a cradle from pine, though there was no child yet, just a quiet hope, shaped by hand and careful planning. Rowena stitched curtains for the cabin they would raise, her stitches neat and sure. When spring came, they built it side by side. He set the frame, she measured for shelves. They planted a garden behind it, carrots and cabbage, and strung a line for drying herbs. The cabin had only 2 rooms, but the windows faced east, and light pooled warm across the floor each morning. They filled it not with things, but with presence, with the smell of coffee, the scrape of boots, the sound of her laughter when he told a story wrong on purpose just to hear it. Years passed. Her uncle passed quietly one winter, his hands folded over his chest, a quilt Rowena had finished years before tucked around his shoulders. They buried him beneath the cottonwoods and planted wildflowers there each spring. They never left that land. Rowena's fiddle found its place on the cabin wall, taken down on quiet nights when the fields lay still. Xander taught himself to whittle, carving handles and spoons, small animals for their son, who came one late August morning with the sun already high and Rowena's hand clenched tight in his. They named him Elias. He grew up knowing the smell of pine pitch and the rhythm of his mother's foot tread on the porch. He learned to ride early, and when he asked where his parents met, Rowena would tell him, "Under a tree after the storm, when all I could do was trust the stranger who wouldn't leave me behind." And Xander would add, "And I never did." They grew old together between the ridgelines and the river's bend. Their love was not loud, not marked with grand gestures, but with the way they moved around each other, the way her hand found his in sleep, the way he watched her cross the yard as though the sun had risen only to light her path. And when the years had worn the hard edges from their bones, when their hair had silvered, and the land had changed around them but never beneath them, they sat again on that cedar bench, fire crackling, Elias's children asleep in the loft. Xander turned to her, voice low. "You still glad you stayed?" Rowena smiled, eyes soft with time and memory. "No, I'm grateful, every single day." He took her hand, just as he had the first time, and the wind outside moved through the trees, gentle as breath. And they stayed there, warm and together, in the home they built from nothing but trust, quiet strength, and the steady choosing of one another.